The road was nothing more than two worn grooves pressed into dry dirt, bordered by brittle yellow grass and scattered rocks, running east from the edge of Milburn Crossing. The town sat behind her now, just a huddle of weathered buildings and empty stairs. And ahead, there was only open land and a stretch of nothing that looked no different than the mile she'd already crossed. The wind had picked up that morning and hadn't settled since, carrying with it the dust of a country that had no interest in comforting newcomers. Clara Wendell had traveled nearly 800 miles over the past month, from a failing boarding house in Carson City where her name had stopped appearing in the ledger, to the edge of a Colorado town where she was supposed to begin again. Her ticket was paid for by a man named Graham Raleigh, a farmer she'd never met, but whose letter had promised room, board, and a future, on paper at least. The wagon had stopped suddenly. No words, no eye contact. The driver, a man who'd said less than 10 sentences since they'd left the last station, climbed down, rounded to the back, and pulled open the flap. Clara's body was stiff. Her back ached from too many days sitting upright. Her coat had lost its warmth 3 nights ago when the stitching along the right sleeve tore open. She stepped down carefully, knees wobbly, the small brown satchel clutched in both hands like it contained something more than a second dress, a few coins, and a copy of the letter she'd memorized. He didn't explain, just nodded toward the horizon and climbed back up. "Is this where?" she started to ask. The reins snapped before she finished. The wagon rolled on. She stood in the road alone, watching the dust swirl behind the back wheels, her breath catching not because she was shocked, but because she had known, deep down, he might do exactly that. She turned in a slow circle, her eyes scanning the land. One direction held a thin dirt path cutting west, framed by hills. The other curved down toward a shallow creek, with scattered tree stumps and chopped logs that suggested somebody was still cutting timber in the area. No sign read Raleigh. No gate. No structure. Not even a smoke trail to indicate life. Her fingers tightened on the satchel. Her mouth was dry. Her legs trembled slightly, but she forced herself to walk to a flat patch of earth near a boulder and sat down. She didn't cry. There wasn't enough energy left for that. She just stared at her boots, listening to the wind scrape past her ears. She felt sick, empty in the gut, like she hadn't eaten in longer than she could remember. And underneath that, a thick weight of panic that was building but hadn't reached her chest yet. Not quite. She didn't know where she was. She didn't know if Raleigh had ever existed. The only mail address on his letter was the general store in Milburn, and when she'd stopped to ask, the clerk had only shaken his head and muttered something about plenty of those letters floating around. She might have been scammed. She might have been abandoned. She might have nothing left except the worn leather boots her brother once gifted her, back before the fever took him in '69. She lowered her head, fingers cold inside her sleeves. An hour passed, maybe longer. The sun was still above the ridge, but the cold was already rising up from the ground. Then wheels. Another wagon, slower than the first. The creak of axles. The faint clink of chain. Clara didn't move. She kept her eyes down, though her heart picked up without permission. The wagon came into view on her left, just beyond a line of bare mesquite trees. A man sat atop it, broad frame, long coat, hat pulled low. He glanced her way, slowed just slightly, then kept going. She watched the back of the wagon disappear, her stomach sinking another notch lower. But a minute later, the sound stopped. The man was still. The wagon, motionless on the trail, just sitting in the dust like a question that hadn't been asked yet. He turned the rig around. When he stopped beside her, she looked up slowly. He was older than she'd expected. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. He had a square jaw, dark eyes, a beard that had gone untended for several days, and the kind of posture that made it clear he didn't talk much unless it was necessary. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't offer a name. He pointed toward the back of the wagon, where a tarp had been pulled over a stack of flour sacks, firewood, and a folded wool blanket. Then he turned away, climbed back up to the bench, and waited. She stood. Her legs were still shaking, and the ground tilted slightly when she moved, but she didn't hesitate. She climbed in, sat with her satchel pressed against her lap, and kept her eyes low. The wagon turned. They headed toward the creek road. He didn't look at her again. She didn't speak. Garrett Hallow was not a man given to sudden decisions. A widower for 6 years, he lived alone with his two children, Tommy, 9, and Elsie, 6, on a plot of land 12 miles outside Melbourne. His wife, May, had died in the second hard winter after the war. Since then, Garrett had spoken only when necessary, trusted no one, and worked the land with the kind of quiet desperation that men earned through failure. He didn't stop for strangers. He didn't go out of his way for things that weren't his responsibility. But when he'd passed the girl on the road, covered in travel dust, hunched beside a rock with nothing but a satchel and a fading look of hope in her face, he hadn't been able to keep going. Not entirely. Not this time. He didn't know who she was. Didn't want to. Not yet. He just knew the cold was coming fast, and no one lasted long outside without shelter. They rode in silence, the wagon creaking, the cold wind rising again as the trail curved up toward the foothills. The sky was growing heavier. There would be frost that night. Neither of them said anything. But neither of them turned away, either. The road leading out of town faded behind them. The wagon creaked beneath the weight of firewood and silence. The man, Garrett Hallow, kept one hand steady on the reins and his eyes fixed forward, jaw tight, body unmoving except when the wheel hit a rut and the whole rig shuddered. The woman beside the sacks didn't speak. She kept her head slightly down, her hands resting on the satchel like it anchored her to something real, something solid. Clara Wendell didn't know what to expect. She didn't know where he was taking her. She hadn't asked. He hadn't offered. But the sky above them was going pale at the edges and the wind was colder by the minute. And he hadn't left her in the dirt. So for now, she would follow wherever the trail went. About a mile up, the land began to rise. The hills were soft and slow, the trees sparse but taller, the ground harder under the wheels. They passed an old fence line, slanted and half-rotted at the posts, then a dry well with a cracked stone lip. When they turned past a leaning pine, a house came into view, a low, simple structure with a sagging roof, one small window shuttered against the cold, and a barn about 50 feet off to the left with its doors swung halfway open. There were 2 hens pecking near a trough and a brown dog lying under the porch, its head lifting at the sound of the wagon. Garrett slowed the team and pulled them to a stop beside the barn. He climbed down without a word. She waited, unsure, until he came around to the side and reached for the tarp. He pulled it back, took the sacks of flour, then the firewood. He carried everything without looking at her, stacking each item by the shed side door. When he returned, he held out one gloved hand. Not for greeting, not for conversation, just a flat gesture toward the house. She climbed down slowly, knees stiff again. Her legs still shook slightly, and she hated that it showed. He didn't wait. He turned, walked to the house, and opened the door. Inside was plain. A stove in the far corner, already lit, with a low fire flickering behind iron grates. 2 chairs, a rough-built table, and a counter with a chipped water basin. One coat hung by the door. There were boots beneath it. A small rug sat worn beneath the table's legs. The room smelled of dry wood, dust, and coffee grounds. 2 children sat on a bench beside the stove. The boy looked about 9, sharp eyes, hair dark like his father's. The girl was smaller, 6 or 7, with pale, freckled cheeks and a wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. They didn't move when Clara stepped in. They just stared. Garrett stepped past them, set the flour on the counter, and turned to the boy. "Tommy, go feed the hens. Chop a basket of kindling. Take Elsie if she wants." The boy nodded once, then looked at Clara again. His stare was hard, not cruel, not angry, just uncertain, like he was trying to figure out what she was and why she was there. Garrett nodded at the bench. "You can sit." Clara sat. He stoked the stove, set a kettle on the burner, poured a scoop of grounds into a dented tin pot. His movements were practiced, quiet, exact. She glanced at the children again. They were gone now, slipping out the door without speaking. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice low. He nodded but didn't answer. She sat still. The warmth from the stove was climbing up her legs now, easing the ache in her back. Her fingers still trembled. Her stomach ached with hunger, but she didn't ask for food. She couldn't bring herself to ask for anything yet. He brought her a cup of coffee. Strong, black, no sugar. She held it with both hands. He sat across from her, his face calm but unreadable. A man used to weather, to solitude, to burden. She forced the words out. My name's Clara Wendell. I was supposed to be married. A man named Graham Raleigh sent for me, but the driver dropped me on the road. Said there was no one waiting. Garrett stared at her a moment, eyes sharp but not unkind. You find his place? She shook her head. No one knew the name of the store. Clerk said he might have left the territory, or maybe never lived here at all. Garrett nodded once, as if none of it surprised him. I don't have family, she added quietly. Not anymore. The kettle hissed gently behind him. I ain't offering anything permanent, he said, after a long pause. You stay tonight. Tomorrow you help feed the stock. If you want to move on after that, I won't stop you. If you don't, we'll see. Clara didn't answer right away. She looked around the room again. The cracked lamp glass, the patched chair, the worn stove, a house held together by effort and function, not comfort. And yet it was the warmest place she'd been in weeks. I'll work, she said. I'm not looking for charity. Garrett gave a faint nod. I got no use for guests. Another pause. Then he stood. There's a cot in the pantry. It ain't much, but it's warm. I'll set a basin and towel. She stood too, her hands clenched tightly around the cup. Thank you, she said again. He didn't answer. He walked in the back room. She heard the rustle of cloth and the scrape of wood, then a bucket of water being poured. She stood alone in the center of the cabin, the fire behind her, the silence all around. And for the first time in many days, she realized no one was going to send her away. Not yet. She didn't know what tomorrow would be. But tonight, she would sleep inside. And for now, that was enough. The next morning came slow and cold. There was no rooster, no light through curtains. Just the dull gray edge of dawn pressing in through the gaps in the wooden slats above the pantry cot, where Clara lay, fully dressed beneath a thin wool blanket, her satchel still tucked under her knees. She hadn't truly slept. Her body was too stiff, her ears too alert to every shift of wood and wind. But sometime during the darkest hours, she'd stopped expecting to be turned out, and that had been enough to keep lying still. The door creaked open just after first light. Garrett didn't say anything. He stood in the hallway, boots already on, shirt buttoned to the throat. He held a folded cloth and a pair of wool gloves. It's colder today, he said. We're starting with the cows. She sat up slowly. Her back ached from the hard cot, but she didn't complain. She took the gloves. Yes, sir. He didn't correct her, just turned and walked back toward the front of the cabin. By the time she stepped outside, the wind had picked up again, stronger than the day before. It came down from the north, slicing across the field with a steady push. The frost had crusted along the edge of the trough, and the grass crunched underfoot. Garrett stood by the barn already, a bucket in one hand, the other resting against the post. The two children were beside him. Tommy held a small hatchet and a bundle of kindling. Elsie stood quietly, scarf tied tight around her chin, clutching a half-cracked egg basket in both hands. They all looked at Clara when she stepped out. No one spoke. She walked toward them, unsure where to stand. Garrett handed her the bucket. Cows will need water first, then hay from the loft. Stall closest to the walls, temperamental. Watch your footing near her. She nodded, taking the bucket without question. Inside the barn, the air was warmer, thick with hay dust and the steady huff of animal breath. The cows moved slow, blinking through the dim light, shifting weight from hoof to hoof as she passed. She hauled water, fetched hay, slipped once in the mud, caught herself on the rail, and kept going. Garrett watched from the doorway, but didn't interfere. Tommy helped stack the firewood. Elsie disappeared into the chicken pen. It wasn't until the work slowed that Clara realized her hands had stopped shaking. Later, Garrett poured hot water into a pan and set it on the stove. He didn't say much over breakfast, biscuits and beans from a pot that had clearly been reheated more than once. But when Tommy asked if she was staying, Clara paused. Garrett answered for her. For now, and Tommy, who had barely looked at her the day before, simply nodded and passed her the plate. That afternoon, while Garrett rode out to check the northern fence line, Clara stayed behind to help Elsie with the laundry. The little girl didn't talk much, but she watched everything. How Clara folded, how she tied the line, how she rubbed her raw hands dry when she thought no one was looking. You come from far away? Elsie asked finally. Yes, Clara said. Far enough. You got any kids? No. Why'd you come here then? Clara hesitated. She could have lied, said something simple, but the girl was too sharp-eyed for that. I thought someone was waiting for me, she said. But he wasn't. Elsie frowned, not quite understanding, but not pushing either. The girl's questions lingered in Clara's mind long after the linens were hung. She hadn't expected to be asked, hadn't expected anyone to care. But the child's voice was soft and curious, not judging, not fearful. Just trying to understand where this strange woman had come from and why her face looked tired even when she smiled. That evening, Garrett returned as the sun was falling low over the hills. He stepped off his horse, tied the reins, and walked toward the shed without a word. Clara watched him from the porch, where she sat shelling beans into a basin. He passed her, then stopped. I fixed the fence, he said. Coyotes been digging near the far post. I'll need help burying the new line tomorrow. She nodded. I'll be ready. He looked at her for a long second, not just at her face, but at her posture, how she sat straight-backed on the wooden bench, sleeves rolled to the elbow, fingers still moving even as he spoke. He didn't smile, but his tone shifted slightly, almost like approval. Good. Then he turned and went inside. That night, she lay in the pantry again, but she wasn't as tense. She folded her coat beneath her head. The satchel stayed by the door this time, not gripped to her chest. The house was quiet but not unfriendly. She could hear Elsie breathing softly in the next room, Garrett moving once near the stove, the faint sound of a chair shifting. She wasn't family. Not yet. She wasn't anything permanent. But she'd worked. She'd stayed. And no one had asked her to leave. In the dark, she thought back to the name, Graham Raleigh, the one that had brought her across mountains and dust and the fraying edge of a promise. She didn't know if he'd ever lived in Milburn, or if he'd just been one more man looking to see how far a woman would come on hope alone. It didn't matter anymore, because she was here now, and someone had turned the wagon around. The next morning began earlier than the last. The sky hadn't yet shifted to blue when Garrett knocked once against the pantry door and called through with a short, quiet, "We'll start in 10." Then he walked off. Clara sat up slowly, already half awake, and folded the blanket neatly. Her hands were sore from the previous day's labor, tight at the knuckles, aching at the base, but she didn't mention it when she stepped outside and saw the shovel leaning against the barn wall. Garrett stood by the gate, horse saddled, coiled rope slung over one shoulder. His coat was heavier today, his beard freshly trimmed. Tommy stood beside him, still tugging at his second boot. Clara crossed the yard, picked up the shovel, and didn't wait to be asked. They rode out toward the northern fence line in silence. Garrett on horseback, Clara and Tommy on the wagon bench. The boy seemed more relaxed now, elbows resting on his knees, jaw chewing at a piece of dry pine needle like it was a habit. He looked over at Clara once, nodded like he did the day before, then went back to watching the path ahead. The wagon creaked as they rolled over frozen soil. The post they were headed for marked the edge of Hallow's property, a wide stretch of hard land leading into pine clusters and broken shale. Garrett didn't speak much during the ride, but when they stopped, he handed Clara the shovel and pointed. That one's loose. Ground sunk beneath it. We dig a new hole 3 feet out, said Clean. You pack the base tight with rock. She nodded. All right. He turned to Tommy. Help with the rail. The work was quiet, the air full of dry wind and cold breath. Clara drove the shovel in, hit rock twice, adjusted, and started again. Garrett watched, stepped in only once to correct her angle, then returned to sawing the fresh rail. When they lifted the new post into place, her shoulders burned from the weight, but she didn't ask for help, and he didn't offer unless it was necessary. It was almost noon by the time the last post was braced. Garrett stood with his hands on his hips, breathing slow, eyes scanning the ridge behind them. Clara turned to him. Is it just you? With the children? He looked at her a moment, then nodded. Their mother passed. Winter of '67. She swallowed hard. I'm sorry. He gave no reply, just started toward the horse. But after a few steps, he added, she took sick the same week my brother was killed. pneumonia, and a broken telegram in the same hour. It was the most he'd said in days. They rode back without words. But something had shifted. Not trust, not comfort, but understanding. Clara hadn't just met a man hardened by the land. She'd met one cut quiet by grief. When they returned, Elsie met them at the porch, cheeks red from cold. "The kettle whistled," she said. "I didn't touch it." Garrett nodded. "Good." Inside, the stove was warm, the coffee thick from sitting. Garrett poured 3 cups and handed one to Clara. She accepted it with a nod. Tommy grabbed a biscuit from the tin and sat on the floor near the fire. Elsie joined him, resting her chin on her knees. After a minute, Clara broke the silence. "Would you like me to wash the linens later?" she asked. "Or sweep the barn?" Garrett looked over. "You don't have to ask. If you see it needs doing, do it." She nodded. "I will." That afternoon, she did just that. Washed the floor, wiped down the window panes, aired the bedding. She found a box of sewing needles tucked behind a flour tin and mended a sleeve on Garrett's shirt where it had started to fray. No one commented, but Tommy watched her work. And that evening, when he handed her the last biscuit on the plate without being told, she saw it for what it was. Later, when Garrett returned from the far shed with a rope and saddlebag, Clara stepped out onto the porch to meet him. The wind had died down. The stars were just beginning to show above the line of the trees. She cleared her throat gently. "May I ask something?" He stopped short, nodding once. "Do you believe Raleigh ever lived here?" she asked. "The man who wrote me. The one who left me on the road." Garrett's face didn't change. He looked past her toward the darkening trail. "I've heard the name. A drifter. Had a plot east of town a year ago. Didn't last long." Clara's breath caught, more from quiet confirmation than surprise. "Did he die?" "No," Garrett said. "Just moved on." She nodded, then looked down. "So, I was a mistake he walked away from." Garrett's voice was low, but firm. "You were never his to begin with." He walked past her, opened the door, and let it close behind him. Clara stayed out a moment longer. The cold had sharpened again. She pulled her shawl tighter. What the man had done, bringing her across 3 states and dropping her name like a coin in the dirt, still stung. But hearing it plain, with no comfort or excuse, was its own kind of clarity. She wasn't waiting for him anymore. She had already been taken in by someone who didn't owe her a thing. A man who didn't speak kindness, but showed it by turning around when no one else would have. When she stepped back inside, the stove was still burning. Garrett was repairing a latch on the window. The children were already curled under their quilts. She closed the door gently. Tomorrow would bring more work. Another dawn, and more questions she might not have answers for. But she'd earn her place here, one task at a time. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like something that had been discarded. She felt like something still standing. The next morning brought a steadier rhythm, as if the land itself had settled into the presence of one more soul under Garrett Hallow's roof. The cold was sharp but not biting, and the sky overhead carried a pale stretch of silver cloud that promised weather by week's end. Clara rose before the knock came and had already pulled her hair into a lone knot by the time the floorboards outside the pantry creaked with morning movement. She stepped out into the main room and saw Garrett at the stove, sleeves rolled, flipping the last of the cornmeal batter into a skillet. Elsie sat at the table, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Tommy was already pulling on boots, his coat half-buttoned, ready for chores. Garrett glanced over his shoulder but didn't say good morning. He didn't have to. He slid the skillet onto the table and poured coffee into 3 tin mugs. He set one in front of Clara without a word, and that, more than anything, told her she was expected. After breakfast, Garrett handed Tommy a list of small tasks to handle near the barn, checking the fence line again, replacing a slat in the chicken coop. Then he looked at Clara. "I need help sorting the tools." "Back shed." She followed him out without question. The shed was older than the barn, half sunk on one side where the ground had shifted after years of thaw and freeze. Inside, it smelled of oil, rust, and damp rope. Wooden crates lined the walls. A workbench sagged under the weight of horseshoe nails and lantern parts. Garrett moved with calm efficiency, pulling down a set of harnesses and laying them out on a crate. Clara stood beside him, waiting for instruction. He handed her a hammer and a bag of bent nails. "These need straightening. That bench is yours." She sat and got to work, holding each nail over the iron plate and striking carefully, breathing slow and steady, the cold steel ringing out each time it made contact. It wasn't just busy work. He was watching, not judging, just learning who she was when no one was asking her to be anyone at all. They worked in silence for over an hour. Then Garrett paused, wiped his hands on a rag, and leaned against the frame of the door, eyes on the trees that bordered the north side of the property. You mentioned no family, he said, without turning. What about before all this? Before Raleigh, Clara kept working as she answered. My father died in a mining camp in 71. He owed too much to too many. My mother followed 6 months later. I kept house at a boarding place after that, out in Nevada. Then the letters started showing up. Men looking for brides. I picked one who sounded decent. Took the chance. Garrett nodded slowly. You ever see a picture of him? No, she said. He didn't send one. I figured he was just plain or ashamed. Didn't matter to me. You think he knew he'd leave you stranded? Clara looked up, met his eyes. Yes. He didn't ask more. The quiet returned, and they worked until her fingers stiffened and his shirt darkened with the sweat of labor. When they were done, she stood, stretched her back, and dusted the filings from her lap. Garrett handed her a cloth, then hesitated. Most folks in town don't know your story. Best keep it that way. I wasn't planning to share it, she said. No one's asked. They will, he said simply. People talk when something changes. She gave a small nod. And has something changed? He looked at her for a long moment. A woman showed up in my barn. That's change enough. Before she could answer, they heard a sharp whistle from across the yard, Tommy's call. Garrett moved fast, crossing the clearing in long strides. Clara followed, the hammer still in her hand. They found Tommy standing just outside the barn, pointing toward the fence. A rider on horseback had stopped at the edge of the property, tall, heavy-set, wrapped in a dark coat, hat low. The man didn't call out, just waited. Garrett walked halfway to the fence before the rider dismounted. Looking for someone, the man said. Garrett didn't reply. The rider glanced toward the house. Name's Raleigh. Graham Raleigh. I sent for a woman months back. Heard she got into town, but the wagon left her. Might have passed this way. Clara, standing just outside the barn door, heard every word. Her stomach tightened. Her grip on the hammer didn't change. Garrett's voice was calm. There's no one here by that name. The man looked past him, then back again. She's got something in mind. A ring. A promise. She needs to come with me. Garrett stepped forward, slow. She's got nothing of yours. The rider stiffened. I could go to the marshal. You do that, Garrett said, and tell him you abandoned a woman on county land. See how he feels about that. Raleigh's eyes narrowed, but he didn't push. Not yet. He climbed back onto his horse, adjusted the reins, and looked once more toward the house. Tell her I'll be back, he said. She can come out quiet, or we can make it something else. Then he turned and rode off, heading back toward the ridge. Garrett watched until the man was out of sight, then turned back toward Clara, who stood still beside the barn, face unreadable. You knew he might come back, Garrett said. I didn't think he'd have a nerve. Well, he does. Are you going to send me away? She asked. He shook his head. No, but you need to understand. If he stirs up trouble in town, people will come knocking. Not for your sake. For mine. For the children. She nodded slowly. Then I'll leave. No, he said sharply. That's not what I said. He walked past her, toward the porch. If he comes again, he'll answer to me. Clara stood there for a moment longer, trying to understand the weight of what had just passed. Garrett Hallow, who spoke rarely, who trusted even less, had drawn a line. And she was standing on the side he'd chosen to defend. The day after Raleigh's visit passed in quiet tension. Like a taut rope, no one dared pull too tight. Garrett didn't speak of the man again. Clara didn't bring it up either. But something had changed, not just in what was said, but in what was done. Garrett spent more time near the front of the property. He kept his rifle propped near the porch instead of in the back room. And when he checked the fence line that evening, he made Tommy stay close to the house. Clara felt the shift not just in Garrett's actions, but in herself. She moved differently now, more careful, more alert. But she also felt a line had been drawn that wouldn't be erased easily. She had not asked him to defend her. She hadn't expected him to. Yet he had, without pause, without condition. It left something in her chest she didn't know how to name. Gratitude, yes. But more than that, safety, in a way she hadn't felt in years. That morning, she helped Elsie with the baking. The little girl was learning to knead dough with both palms, clumsy but determined. Clara showed her how to press gently with the heel of her hand, fold, turn, press again. Garrett passed through once, nodded silently when he saw them, then stepped outside without comment. I like when you help, Elsie said, dusting flour from her hands. I like being here, Clara answered. Are you going to stay forever? Clara hesitated. That's not always up to me. Elsie frowned. Pa likes you. He doesn't talk much, but he watches. He don't do that with folks he doesn't trust. Clara folded the towel over the rising dough and gave a small smile. We'll see. That afternoon, Clara asked Garrett if she could help with the livestock books. He looked at her, surprised. You know numbers? He asked. Well enough, she replied. I kept ledgers at the boarding house, managed credit tabs, tallied rent, ordered flour by the month. I'm not a school teacher, but I can read a balance. Garrett handed her the worn notebook from the shelf beside the stove. He didn't say it, but the gesture was plain. This wasn't about work, this was trust. He was letting her see the numbers behind the ranch, the debts, the shortfalls, the margin between surviving the winter or selling off the cattle come spring. She took the book to the table and opened it slowly. It was tidy, sparse, a man's record-keeping, clear columns, no room for error. As she read, she began to understand what Garrett hadn't said out loud. The ranch was holding on by a thread. The drought 2 summers ago had weakened the herd. The price of feed was up, and the town's grain supplier, run by a man named Carlin, had extended credit twice, but no more. Clara set the book down. You're in tight, she said. Garrett sat across from her. Been that way 2 years. It's not the land's fault. It's just what it costs to raise 2 kids and keep your name. You ever think about selling? She asked gently. He stared at her. Not once. And not now. She didn't challenge it. She just nodded. Then we find a way to make it stretch. Garrett looked at her, eyes steady. You saying you're part of that we? Clara held his gaze. I've been working beside you for a week. Feeding your stock. Sewing your sleeves. Sitting at your table. That make me just a visitor? He didn't reply. Not with words. But after a moment, he leaned back, crossed his arms, and let out a slow breath through his nose. You keep the books then, he said. From now on. That night, something shifted again. Clara didn't sleep in the pantry. She stayed late at the table, writing figures in a fresh page Garrett had given her. By the time she stood to turn in, he had already laid a blanket on the bench near the stove and nodded toward it. The gesture was quiet but clear. Closer now. Not in the same room, but not behind a door anymore. The children said nothing. They simply accepted it. 2 days later, Clara rode into town with Garrett. It was the first time she'd been back since the day she was abandoned. She wore the same coat, the same boots, but her posture was straighter now, her eyes more alert. She rode beside Garrett on the wagon bench. He didn't introduce her, didn't explain her presence, but he made no effort to hide her either. When they stopped at Carlin's general store, Garrett stepped down and held out his hand to help her down as well. Inside, the room went quiet for a beat. Carlin looked up from the counter. His mouth twitched, recognition flickering. Well now, he said, didn't expect to see you walk back in. Claire met his gaze directly. I'm here to review your ledgers. Garrett says you've got 2 invoices waiting. Carlin blinked. You keeping his books now? She's part of the house, Garrett said flatly. You got something to say it. Carlin looked between them, then turned, muttering something about ink and bills. Outside, Garrett handed the supplies to Tommy and Elsie, who had waited near the wagon. Clara paused on the steps, watching the street. He's still here, she said. Raleigh. Garrett nodded. He's keeping quiet. Marshall knows who he is. But folks in town don't care unless trouble's brought to their door. Clara's voice lowered. If he comes back to the ranch, he won't get far. She looked at him. Why are you risking this? You've got 2 children. You've got land to protect. I'm not your responsibility. Garrett didn't look at her when he answered. I turned the wagon around, didn't I? She studied his face. The way he said it, not with tenderness, not with drama, just fact. Yes, he had turned the wagon around. and he hadn't stopped since. The first snow came late that year, drifting slow and quiet across the high grass and settling into every hollow of the land like it had been waiting for a reason to fall. It wasn't heavy, just a soft layer that coated the rail fence and the roof of the barn, enough to muffle footsteps and mark the turning of the season without bringing the work to a stop. Clara stood on the porch early that morning, watching the pale sky rise above the distant ridge, her breath curling in front of her. The ranch looked still, peaceful even, but she knew better. Stillness never meant safety in places like this. It only meant you had a moment to prepare. Garrett stepped out behind her, pulling on his gloves. "Storm coming behind this one," he said. "We'll need to move the stock in before nightfall." She nodded, already wrapping her shawl tighter. The children were inside, finishing breakfast. Elsie had started sitting close to Clara in the mornings, watching how she stirred the oats or folded the cloth napkins or organized the shelves without being asked. Tommy had grown less guarded too, though he still watched everything around him like he was keeping score no one else could read. That morning, Clara helped stack feed in the barn loft while Garrett reinforced the south gate. They didn't speak much, but they didn't have to. Their routines had settled into something steady, shared without discussion, earned through repetition. It wasn't romance. It wasn't comfort. It was the quiet reality of two people surviving the same stretch of land, choosing to stay when leaving might have been easier. By midday, the wind picked up, and with it, Raleigh returned. Garrett saw him first, riding in from the tree-line on a dull gray horse, face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, coat buttoned to the neck. This time, he didn't wait by the fence. He rode straight up the yard, slow but deliberate. Claire stepped out from the barn just as Garrett was already moving forward, rifle slung casually in one arm, jaw set firm. Raleigh stopped his horse and looked down at them both. "You think you can keep her here like that?" he said. "That you can just take what I paid for and call it yours?" Garrett didn't move. "You paid for a letter," he said. "Not a woman. And she's not yours." Raleigh leaned forward slightly in the saddle, voice lower now. "That woman was promised to me. I got the letter. I got the right. I've been to the marshal. He said if she's with you willingly, it's not his concern. But this town, these people, they don't look kindly on stolen things." Claire stepped forward then, past Garrett. She didn't speak loudly, didn't raise her chin like she had something to prove. She just looked Raleigh in the eye. "I wasn't stolen," she said. "I was left. You made a promise in writing and broke it before I ever saw your face. You left me on the side of a road with no name and no place to go. This man didn't take me. He turned back. You kept riding." Raleigh sneered. "You think anyone in town's gonna side with a woman who showed up with no name and no family? You think they'll take your word over mine?" Garrett stepped forward again. "I don't care what they take. You don't come back here." Raleigh studied him. "She's worth that to you?" Garrett's voice didn't change. "More." There was a long pause. The horse shifted. The wind cut across the yard, lifting dust along the porch rail. Raleigh spat once near the hoof and turned the reins. "You'll regret this," he muttered. Then he rode off again, faster this time, kicking snow behind him. Garrett stood still until the rider disappeared over the ridge. Clara exhaled only then, the air coming out of her like it had been pressed down too long. She turned toward Garrett. "Why didn't you tell me the marshal had no authority over this?" she asked. "Didn't matter," Garrett said. "You weren't going anywhere. Even if the town starts asking questions." He looked at her, eyes calm. "Let them ask." She stared at him. "You don't care what they think. I care what's right." It was a simple answer, but in a town like Milburn Crossing, where rumor could spread faster than snow melt, it wasn't a small statement. That night, Claire stayed up late at the kitchen table again, going over the ledgers. Garrett sat across from her, carving a piece of pine for the broken drawer handle. Elsie slept in the cot by the stove. Tommy had gone to bed early. She paused in her writing. "You never told me much about your wife." Garrett didn't stop carving. "May was quiet. Like me. Grew up 3 towns east. I knew her 5 months before we married. We didn't speak much, even then." Clara waited. She didn't have people either. Said that made it easier to stay. "We worked side by side. Had Tommy a year later. Elsie after that. And then she passed," Clara said softly. He nodded. Winter came early. Snow too deep to get to town. I did everything I could, but it wasn't enough. Clara looked down. I'm sorry. He looked at her then. You don't have to be. And something in his tone, for the first time, wasn't about closing doors. It was about beginning to leave one cracked open. Later, when she lay down on the bench near the stove again, the blanket tucked around her shoulders, she could hear Garrett moving in the next room. Just quiet steps. Nothing heavy. She knew now. He'd built this life not to protect himself from others, but because there had been no one left worth protecting until now. She wasn't a guest anymore, and no matter what the town believed, she wasn't going anywhere. The storm arrived 2 days after Raleigh's second visit, heavier and sharper than the one before. Snow came in sideways, carried by wind that howled across the low valley and slapped against the windows like it meant to break them. By midday, the sky was near white, the barn doors frozen at the hinges, and even Garrett's boots stuck deeper than expected in the packed drifts. Clara didn't need to be told what to do. She was up before the children, hauling water in tin buckets from the covered well, gathering the eggs before they froze solid. Garrett had built a second fire near the barn wall, using spare boards and dry hay just to keep the livestock from icing through the night. Every time they crossed paths, he simply nodded. That was enough. Inside the house, Elsie sat bundled under 2 quilts, holding her doll in one arm and a wool scarf in the other, helping Clara mend it by mimicking the stitches. Tommy had taken over splitting kindling, his hands red and sore, but steady. He was growing into himself, silent, sharp-eyed, and loyal to the rhythm of the place. That night, the storm peaked. The wind roared across the rafters. The old pantry door rattled. Snow climbed halfway up the porch rail. Clara stood near the stove, holding a pot of stew she'd managed to stretch from the last root cellar haul. When Garrett came in from the barn, beard crusted with ice, face flushed, arms heavy with a wet saddle blanket, she turned without speaking and took the blanket from him. He said nothing either, just stripped off his gloves and stood in the warmth, breathing hard. When the stew was served, the 4 of them sat quietly at the table. No prayers, no talk, just the sound of spoons against tin bowls and the storm cracking against the roof overhead. After the children had gone to sleep, Tommy curled in the corner room. Elsie tucked behind the stove, Clara stayed by the fire. Garrett joined her minutes later, pulling the chair back slightly so he could rest one boot against the hearth. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It just was. Then Garrett said, "You ever think about leaving?" She looked at him. "You mean now?" "I mean it all." She thought for a moment. "I did. When I first got here, I thought I should. That I had to keep from making more trouble." He looked over, waiting. "But now I don't think about leaving," she added. "I think about how to stay." Garrett turned his gaze back to the fire. "I keep expecting someone to knock on the door. Townsfolk. Lawmen. Someone looking to make this harder than it already is." Clara sat straighter. "What would you do?" He didn't hesitate. Closed the door behind them. There was a long pause. Then she asked something that had been waiting since the beginning. "Why did you turn around?" He didn't answer right away. Then said, "Because I've seen too many people left behind." "Your brother?" Garrett nodded once. "He was wounded outside Vicksburg. Sent north. Never made it. They said the wagon was full and they'd come back for him. They didn't. I read the letter 2 weeks later." Clara lowered her eyes. "I didn't stop the first time I saw you because I knew what that road meant. I just didn't want to carry another weight I couldn't explain. But halfway home, I realized not turning back would be worse." "You didn't owe me anything," Clara said. "Doesn't mean I could leave you there." She looked at him then fully. "I'm glad you didn't." They sat there, the fire low now, flickering in the iron belly of the stove. Then Garrett stood. "You're not in the pantry anymore." Clara raised a brow. "No." He shook his head. "That room back there used to be May's sewing room. Has a bed. Window don't close right, but it's warmer than a bench." Clara watched him for a moment, waiting to see if there was more to the offer. There wasn't. She stood slowly. "I'll move my things." He nodded once and turned away, disappearing down the hall. She walked back into the room she hadn't dared to enter before. The door creaked slightly. The air inside smelled like cedar and old cotton. There was a small bed against the wall, the frame plain, the quilt folded carefully. It was the first room she'd stepped into since arriving that felt like someone had once waited here, for mending, for conversation, for a child to finish learning how to thread a needle. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself breathe. Later that night, when the storm died down and the house was silent but for the soft whimper of wind pulling at the eaves, she heard Garrett's voice through the wall. "You don't owe me anything either." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. They understood each other now. Not with words, not with promises, but with something deeper, earned in silence, built in labor, and held together by the act of staying when leaving would have been simpler. And the house, for the first time in years, felt whole again. The storm broke for good by morning. The sky cleared in long, flat bands of cold blue, and the snow, once blinding, now sat motionless across the pasture like a quiet sheet of memory, reflecting back the days that had passed in silence and decision. Smoke rose steady from the chimney. The house creaked and settled as if exhaling. And Clara Wendell, now sleeping in a room that had once held another woman's quiet hours, woke before anyone else. She dressed without rush, pulled on the boots Garrett had left by the door, and walked the property line by herself. It was the first time she'd done so. She checked the barn, the far gate, the trough still packed with snow. Everything was in place, but she wasn't walking for reassurance. She was walking to understand the land, what she was now part of, what had once belonged only to a grieving man and two watchful children. Inside, the table was already set. Garrett had left coffee warming on the stove, a folded note beside it in simple pencil. "Town at noon. Come if you want." She stood for a long while at the counter before deciding. By midday, she rode beside him. This time, no one stared. Milburn Crossing wasn't a loud town. It didn't have a courthouse, and its marshal mostly worked out of a back room in the saloon. But it had a rhythm of its own. Wagons moving slow through slush, the bell at the blacksmith shop clanging metal against metal, and a scent of wood smoke and manure braided together in the air like it had always been there. They tied the horse near the general store. Garrett adjusted his coat collar. Clara stepped down and didn't wait behind him. Inside, Carlin looked up. "Ledger's balanced," he said, setting a crate on the counter. "Last week's payment cleared." Garrett nodded. "Good." Clara scanned the shelves. "Do you sell ink by the bottle?" "Only 2 left," Carlin replied. "You talk keen over all his writing now." "She's better at it than I ever was," Garrett said. There was no joke in his tone, just fact. Outside, the saloon doors swung open with a sudden slap of wind. 2 men stepped out. One of them paused, stared. Clara recognized him immediately. Kellen Hayes, Raleigh's friend. She remembered his eyes from the first wagon. He'd been the one holding the reins the day she was left behind. He didn't say anything, but his mouth curled slightly when he saw her. That was enough. They left town not long after. Garrett didn't mention a man, but Clara could feel his awareness, tight in the shoulders, quiet in the eyes. When they reached the ridge, Garrett finally spoke. "They've been asking around. About the ranch. About you." She looked straight ahead. "I figured they would." "I heard something else," he added. "Raleigh's talking about filing a claim." Clara turned to him. "On what grounds?" "Says he paid for your travel. Says you're in breach." Clara scoffed softly, then steadied herself. "He wants to shame me, or push me off your land." Garrett nodded. "That's all it is. Pressure. He doesn't want you back. He just wants to win something." They rode the rest of the way in silence. That evening, Garrett didn't light the stove. He opened the back shed instead and retrieved the second rifle, the one he hadn't used in nearly 5 years. He cleaned at the table while Clara prepared supper. The sound of metal against cloth was slow, deliberate, without flair. He wasn't making a threat. He was making a promise, to himself, to her, to the house. Clara didn't speak until the meal was finished and the children were asleep. Then she sat across from him, folded her hands, and said plainly, "You've given me more than shelter." Garrett looked up. "You gave me something to wake up for," she continued. "A reason to stay. I want to protect this place just as much as you do. But I need to know, if it gets worse, if he tries to come through town with papers or men, what will you do?" Garrett didn't flinch. "I'll stand in front of the door." "That's not what I mean." "I know." He leaned forward, arms resting on the table. "If he brings law, we'll answer with truth. If he brings trouble, we'll meet it. But I won't let him take this from you. Or from me." There was a pause. Then Clara spoke again, more carefully now. Do you think the town would defend you? Garrett thought for a long moment. No, not at first. But they'll watch. And if we stand long enough, they'll stop doubting. They'll stop listening to his story. And they'll remember mine. What story is that? He looked her directly in the eyes. The one where I lost everything and still chose to stay. That night, Clara packed away the old ledgers into a small box and slid it under the bed. She took May's old quilt and laid it across the foot of her own, smoothing it out with both hands. She didn't need to claim the house. She didn't need to own anything. She only needed to belong where she stood. Outside, the snow began again, but lighter this time, gentler, as if the land had grown tired of fighting. Garrett checked the lock on the door, banked the fire, and paused in the doorway of her room. You need anything? He asked. No, she said. I've got everything I need. He nodded once, then turned to leave. But before the door closed, she added, Garrett, you didn't just turn the wagon around. You gave me a life I didn't know I was still allowed to want. He didn't answer, but the look he gave her then said what neither of them had yet dared to speak out loud. Not yet, but soon. It was a Tuesday morning when Raleigh came back for the last time. There was no warning, no letter, no rider ahead to sound his approach. Just the echo of hooves over hard ground, slicing through the silence as Clara stood outside, hanging laundry on the line. The wind was calm. The sky was clear. There'd been no storm. But her hands froze on the clothespin the moment she heard the sound. Garrett stepped out from the barn before she could call his name. His rifle was already slung over one shoulder. His coat wasn't even buttoned. He didn't need to ask. He already knew. Raleigh rode in bold this time, straight through the gate, chin high, jaw set. Two men followed behind him, both strangers, both with the same hollow confidence that came from being paid, not principled. Garrett stood in the middle of the yard, boots planted, arms loose, calm as the wind itself. He didn't raise the rifle, didn't shout. He just waited. Clara stepped up behind him, slow but steady. She didn't try to stop him. She just stood beside him. Not behind, not out of view, but beside. Raleigh pulled the reins, dismounted with flair, and unfolded a slip of paper from inside his coat. This is a legal claim, he announced, signed by the county notary. You're holding property that don't belong to you. Garrett didn't move. No man owns a person. Not by law. Not in this territory. Raleigh smirked. She traveled on my name. I paid her fair. She failed to fulfill the agreement. Clara stepped forward. I fulfilled my end. I came. You weren't there. You left me on the road. The taller of the two hired men muttered, doesn't matter. She was promised. Garrett's voice came low and clear. She promised nothing to you. She gave her no vow. You gave her no home. Raleigh held up the paper again. This says otherwise. Garrett took a single step forward. Then take it to the marshal. I did. He said it's a civil matter. Then you ride back to town and file your claim. Raleigh narrowed his eyes. You're not going to stop me if I take her right now. Garrett's jaw locked. You'd have to go through me. A pause. Then Clara's voice. And me. The moment hung heavy. The two hired men exchanged glances. Garrett's rifle remained at his side. But there was no question what would happen if Raleigh moved wrong. Raleigh took a slow breath. Looked at Clara. Looked at the children watching from a porch. Looked at the land around him, quiet, firm, alive in its own way. Then he folded the paper, tucked it back into his coat. This isn't over, he said, but his voice had thinned. The weight behind it was gone. No, Garrett said, it is. Raleigh mounted up. His men followed. And together, they rode off, slower than they came, without the same purpose. When the hooves had faded, Garrett turned to Clara. You all right? She nodded, breath steady. Yes. He looked toward the children, then back at her. They saw everything. They should, Clara said. They'll know what it looks like when someone stands for something that matters. Garrett didn't answer, just gave the faintest nod, and together they walked back toward the house. That night, they didn't speak of Raleigh again. He was gone. The matter was finished. No letters arrived. No lawman came. The town, as it always had, moved on. People talked, but no one came to ask questions. Not when they saw Garrett in the store beside Clara. Not when Tommy rode in for seed. Not when Elsie walked hand in hand with Clara on Sundays. Spring came early. The frost gave way to wet ground, and the first green returned to the field by the western fence. The livestock fattened, the hens laid heavier, and on a morning without ceremony, Garrett stepped into the sewing room, the room that had once been May's, and found Clara folding sheets with the window open. He didn't clear his throat, didn't shuffle. He just said, "I want you to stay." She turned slowly. "I already have." "No," he said. "I mean stay fully. Not as a guest. Not as a worker. As mine." Clara blinked once, then stepped forward. "You sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything since May," he said. "And she'd want me to choose again." Clara's eyes shone, but she didn't cry. She just touched his chest with both hands and said, "Then you have me." The wedding was quiet. No music, no crowd, just the children, a preacher from the next county over, and 2 chairs in the field near the cottonwoods. Garrett didn't wear a suit. Clara didn't wear white. But they stood still, side by side, and said yes in the only way that mattered. That night, they didn't sit in silence. They talked about the land, about the next season, about where to dig a new well, about planting tomatoes, about giving Elsie her own room. Garrett asked her where she wanted to keep the books. Clara said, "Next to yours." And as the sun dipped behind the ridge, and the house filled with the scent of firewood and bread, no one knocked. No one interrupted. And for once, there was no more fear. Just a home, built not by chance, but by the quiet decision to turn around and stay. Forever.